Nothing is worse than being in the middle of a power outage or an electricity shortage or rolling blackouts, you name it. We were in a snowstorm a few years ago, hurricanes, wherever you live in the world, you should be preparing for the potential possibility of a food shortage, of an electrical outage, of some type of natural disaster that might separate you from the modern civilized world. Because if it got bad enough and you had to maintain your gluten-free status, remember, if it gets bad, being gluten-free is an essential part of your health. You don't want your health deteriorating during a natural disaster or a time of a disaster where you have to be prepared to think and make decisions quickly and to make intelligent decisions without worried about how inflamed you're going to be because you ate something because you didn't prepare. Remember, most Americans are 3 meals away from starvation. If you go into their homes and you look in their refrigerators, you look at what they actually have stored away, most people have no idea what will happen if there's a food shortage or if the lights go out or if the restaurants aren't open to prepare your food. So again, I'm having this show because I want you to be really, really prepared. I don't want to scare you. I want to prepare you. There's an old adage, and that is, simply put, chance favors the prepared. You're not lucky in cases of emergency. You don't just stumble your way out of it. I mean, I've had 3 major situations in my life, emergency situations, where had I not been prepared, I would have had a heck of a problem. And so I'll share some of those with you. Once I was in San Diego, this was over 10 years ago, and the entire city's power went down. Nobody knew why. The cell phone towers were down. The electricity was out. The hotel I was staying at, complete power loss. That means air conditioning, again, cell phones. There was no internet. There was no ability to communicate. Nobody knew why. We didn't know if it was a terrorist attack. We didn't know if it was a rolling blackout. Nothing. No ability to communicate. And so here I was I'm not from San Diego. I'm from Houston. So I was traveling. I was on the road, right? And I was very, very lucky that I do what I always do when I travel. I have a food suitcase or a food backpack with me, and that's partly because I want to stay gluten-free when I travel. I don't want to end up eating something that I had to regret later, taking on some damage. But it was so bad where we were. The hotel was rolling out Mike and Ike candy boxes, and that's what they were rolling out as food in the lobby. Cheese crackers, candy, like this is what we had to eat. Right, and so if you didn't get out there first, like when the power went out, what we had to do is me and a couple of friends I was there with, we hit the streets of San Diego downtown, and we went and we sought food out because again the power was out, the restaurants were out, so you didn't have a lot of options. There were some restaurants who were prepared for an event, and they had propane stoves and other things, or they had food that was already prepared. But once it was out, and you didn't know when it was going to come back. Scary to think about, again, considering that most Americans are 3 quick meals away from going hungry. And so I was fortunate that I had the foresight, as I always do when I travel, to carry cash with me, because when the power's out, you can't pay electronically. Many of you are growing up in today's world where you don't use cash as a currency. You use a credit card or a debit card or Apple Pay or Google Pay or one of these electronic options. But if the electricity's gone, you have no option to pay. So you got to have emergency cash on hand. And it was fortunate for me in San Diego to have that, because I was able to secure a meal, not knowing when that power was going to come back on. I was able to secure a meal that was actually gluten-free. That worked out pretty well. But I had backup food in my hotel room in my backpack as well. So that was one event that came without note, and that power was down for over 24 hours. So it didn't come back up. And again, I couldn't call. I didn't know why. It came on the next day. We were fortunate. It could have been something much bigger and much more catastrophic. Blessed that it wasn't. There was another year, this was a couple of years ago, Hurricane Ike. Hurricane Ike was a major hurricane that hit the coast of Texas, South Texas, and it knocked the power out for 2 weeks. Now, within the first day of the power going out, the grocery stores in the local area were completely empty. The shelves were totally decimated. You couldn't buy anything. So if you didn't have stored food and you didn't prepare, there were empty cans. There were the cans that had no label, the ones, the silver cans on the. And so it's like the mystery buy. You go in, you buy it, and maybe it's lima beans, right? Who likes lima beans? raise your hand. But no, all kidding aside, the food was gone in a day. If you live in a major metropolitan area, that's the way it works. The food's gone in a day. If you're out in the country, it might be a little bit different. But if you're in a major city area, there's millions of people there. The food will go first. The food and the water. We were without power for 2 weeks. And at the time, we didn't have a generator. I didn't have a generator on my home. That was the last time I ever got caught without a generator. Lesson learned for me. But we relied on the frozen meat in our freezer, the frozen food in our freezer. It stayed good for about 5 to 6 days because there was so much stored in it that its frozenness kept it cold. And so as long as we weren't opening the thing up over and over and over again, the coolness in the freezer maintained the integrity of the food. So we were able to get by and eat off of that frozen meat storage. We also had a lot of frozen canned goods, or not frozen, but stored canned goods that we were able to tap into as well. So that got us through 2 weeks of no power. But then in Texas, if you've ever been here, you can swim in the air. It's so humid in South Texas, and so no air conditioning, so no electricity. That means no fans. That means no airflow. So pretty hot event. And so again, it was something that we had the food prepared for it because again, the grocery store shelves were empty, the power was out, restaurants couldn't cook you food, you couldn't just order food in to go. You had to have a way to do it. Now, one of the things that did save me at that time was the fact that I had a gas propane outdoor grill. And so that came in very handy for cooking because otherwise, what would you cook on if you have an electric stove? Now, some of you may say, well, I have a gas stove. Well, it's possible that the power can go out and affect the gas equipment as well, because a lot of that is operated by the power grid. And so, again, it's possible you might not have access to that. So, lesson for me in that for you is, if you're not a grill or a barbecue kind of guy, get you some gas burners. You go over to the local sporting goods store, camping store, buy a couple, store it in your garage, get you 10 to 20 gallons of extra propane that you can cook off of. If you have to, boil the water. I mean, we had a boiled water advisory because the water, we were worried about it being contaminated because of the rain and the floods. So, we had to boil the water to drink it. So again, what are you going to boil it with if you don't have anything to heat it up with? I mean, raise your hand, those of you who have gone through Boy Scouts and Cub Scouts and Boy Scouts, and you know how to start a fire with a fire bow, or you know how to start a fire in a pinch. I mean, most of you probably don't have those as skill sets. Not to say that some of you don't, but you need to have access to these emergency type items should you lose the technology. We're so dependent on technology today. You have no idea just how horrific the world could get, even it going beyond a couple of weeks. There's a third time I ran out of power, and that was actually last year, and that was during the big freeze in Texas where the power grid completely failed. And so what was happening here is not only did the power go out, but because it went out, you couldn't heat your home. And so if you had your pipes in the attic could freeze, and then the frozen pipes would expand and burst. And so now you're out of power and you've got 3 inches of water on your floor. What are you going to do to stay warm? You can't light a fire in your house, right? And it's under below zero outside. So what are you going to do to stay warm? This is what the reality was for a lot of people. They weren't prepared for it. They didn't have clothing. They didn't have a tent they could pitch in the backyard that was rated for any type of cold weather. They didn't have adequate clothing, blankets, jackets. They didn't have adequate things to start a fire with. If you live in the city, you can't just light a fire in your backyard. I guess if your life depended on it, you could, but you want to think about these types of things when you're thinking about how to prepare for an emergency. You want to brainstorm these things. It's very, very important that if you don't have a plan and something does happen, the consequences could be quite harsh. So nothing wrong with some pre-planning going into this. For me, I told you the last time I didn't have a generator was during a hurricane, so I made sure I had a generator after that. And so when the power went out in Texas, we had power because we had a generator. That was just something I thought was an investment well worth having, and it's paid off a number of times since then. So if you can afford a generator, there are a number of different options. Some people opt for whole house generators. Some people buy the gas or the diesel generators, but you want to have one that's strong enough that you could plug in. You could plug in some electrical devices, including your freezer or your refrigerator, so that you can keep your stored food, your cold stored food, from rotting on you because you just don't know when that power is going to come back on. That's the whole thing. That's why it's called an emergency. You don't know when they're going to be able to get it back on. Sometimes, we depend upon our society too much for the conveniences that we are all used to. And my point in having tonight's show is to hammer home to you, look, it happened to me 3 times. And really more than that. That's just 3 times in my adulthood. It's happened to me plenty as a child. I grew up in Houston, and so hurricanes were not an unregular event. They were pretty common. That being said, what are you going to do if that happens? So I want to talk a little bit about how you can prepare. And so, hey, don't forget to check out the rest of the series right here. Make sure you hit subscribe below. And as always, thanks for tuning in.